The summer heat in the small town of Pine Ridge was relentless, shimmering off the cracked asphalt of St. Mary's Hospital parking lot like waves on a distant horizon. Sarah Matthews pulled her weathered Honda Civic into her usual spot, the same space she'd parked in for the past 5 years during her shifts in the emergency room. The car wasn't much to look at: faded blue paint, a small dent in the passenger door from a shopping cart incident, and a Nurses Save Lives bumper sticker that had started to peel at the corners. But it was reliable, just like Sarah herself. Hospital grounds were quiet at this early hour, the kind of peaceful that only existed in the moments before dawn. The morning shift wouldn't start for another 30 minutes, but Sarah always arrived early. It gave her time to gather her thoughts, review patient charts, and prepare for whatever challenges the day might bring. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few cars belonging to the night shift staff who would soon be heading home. Sarah gathered her belongings: a worn leather bag containing her scrubs, a thermos of coffee that would probably go cold before she got a chance to drink it, and a small lunchbox with the meal she'd packed the night before. As she stepped out of her car, the sound of distant motorcycles caught her attention. It wasn't unusual to hear bikes in Pine Ridge, especially since the town sat along a popular route for riders heading to the coast. But something about the approaching rumble made her pause. The morning air was thick with humidity, carrying the scent of impending rain and freshly cut grass from the hospital's well-maintained lawns. Sarah could see Mrs. Henderson, one of the elderly volunteers, already setting up the information desk inside the hospital's glass entrance. The woman's silver hair caught the first rays of sunlight as she arranged pamphlets and checked the sign-in sheet, completely unaware of the growing tension in the air outside. The motorcycle sounds grew louder, echoing off the buildings that surrounded the parking lot. Sarah couldn't explain why, but something about the approaching noise made her skin prickle. She'd worked enough emergency room shifts to know when trouble was brewing. 5 years of treating everything from minor scrapes to major traumas had given her a sixth sense about these things. The same instinct that told her when a patient was about to crash was now telling her something wasn't right. A group of 4 motorcycles appeared at the entrance to the parking lot, their engines deliberately revving louder than necessary. They moved slowly, almost predatory, as they circled the nearly empty lot. Sarah could see their riders clearly now: 3 men and a woman, all dressed in black leather despite the heat. Their bikes were expensive customs, chrome gleaming in the early morning light, but there was something menacing about the way they moved, like sharks circling in shallow water. The lead rider, a man with a shaved head and a thick beard, shot Sarah a look that made her blood run cold. His eyes were hidden behind mirrored sunglasses, but his smirk was clearly visible beneath his facial hair. He revved his engine again, the sound echoing off the hospital walls like thunder. The noise was inappropriate for a hospital zone where patients were trying to rest and recover, but that seemed to be exactly why he was doing it. Sarah clutched her bag closer to her chest and started walking toward the hospital entrance. She'd dealt with all types in the ER: drunk college students, angry patients, grieving families, but something about these bikers set off every alarm bell in her head. They weren't the usual weekend riders who sometimes came through town. These people radiated trouble. As she walked, she could hear them talking and laughing, their voices carrying across the parking lot. One of them wolf whistled, the sound sharp and offensive in the morning quiet. Sarah quickened her pace, her nursing shoes making soft sounds against the asphalt. She was almost to the entrance when she heard the bikes moving again, this time coming closer to where she'd parked her car. "Hey, sweetheart," one of them called out, his voice rough with mockery. "Nice ride you got there. Bet you can't afford anything better on a nurse's salary, huh?" Sarah kept walking, her jaw clenched. The hospital's security guard wouldn't arrive for another 15 minutes. Budget cuts had reduced their coverage, leaving gaps in the early morning hours. She could see Mrs. Henderson looking up from her desk now, concern evident on her face as she reached for the phone, likely calling security or the police. The sound of boots on pavement made Sarah's heart rate spike. She resisted the urge to look back, maintaining her steady pace toward the entrance. The morning sky had taken on a steely grey color, matching the growing tension in the air. A few more staff members were arriving now, their cars pulling into the lot, but they seemed to sense the situation and stayed in their vehicles, watching with concern. What these outlaws didn't know, couldn't know, was that Sarah's brother, Nathan Matthews, had just returned home after his final tour with the Navy SEALs. He was staying with her while transitioning back to civilian life, sleeping on her couch just a few miles away. Nathan, who had spent the last 12 years serving in some of the world's most dangerous places, who had earned multiple commendations, that he never talked about, who still woke up at dawn every morning to run 5 miles before most people had their first cup of coffee. But Sarah wasn't thinking about Nathan now. She was thinking about her patients, about the shift she needed to start, about the lives that depended on her being focused and prepared. The outlaw's laughter echoed behind her, along with the sound of something metallic scraping against metal. She forced herself to keep walking, even as her instincts screamed at her to run. Thunder rumbled in the distance, promising a storm that would match the brewing tension in the St. Mary's Hospital parking lot. Sarah reached for the door handle, her fingers trembling slightly as the sound of more motorcycles approaching filled the air. The morning was about to take a turn that none of them could have anticipated, least of all the outlaws, who thought they'd found an easy target in a small-town nurse and her modest car. Sarah Matthews had always been the kind of nurse other staff members relied on during a crisis. Her calm demeanor and steady hands had earned her a reputation in St. Mary's emergency room as someone who could handle anything. At 32, she'd seen enough trauma and tragedy to last a lifetime, but she'd never lost her compassion or her determination to help others. Her shoulder-length brown hair was always neatly tied back, her scrubs always clean and pressed, even after the most challenging shifts. The daughter of a high school teacher and a librarian, Sarah had grown up in Pine Ridge alongside her younger brother Nathan. While she had chosen a path of healing, Nathan had felt called to serve in a different way. Their paths had diverged when he enlisted in the Navy at 18, but their bond had remained unbreakable. Through deployments, through loss, through everything life had thrown at them, they had stayed connected through letters, video calls, and the rare, precious moments when he was home. Now, as Sarah stood just inside the hospital entrance, she could feel her hands shaking slightly as she watched the outlaws through the glass doors. They were still circling her car, their intentions becoming clearer with each passing moment. The leader, the one with the shaved head, was running, his gloved hand along her car's hood, leaving smudges on the already faded paint. His companions were laughing, their voices carrying through the morning air. Mrs. Henderson had abandoned her post at the information desk and was now standing beside Sarah, her usually cheerful face creased with worry. "I've called security," the older woman whispered, "and the police. They're on their way." But Sarah knew it would take time. The local police station was on the other side of town, and the morning shift change would slow their response. Through the glass, Sarah could see more of her colleagues arriving, their cars slowing as they took in the scene. Some turned around and left, unwilling to risk parking near the troublemakers. Others parked as far away as possible, hurrying toward the building with their heads down. The outlaws seemed to feed off this fear, their laughter growing louder, more aggressive. Sarah's thoughts drifted to Nathan, who had only been back in Pine Ridge for 3 weeks. He'd changed during his last deployment. They all did, she knew, but there was something different about him this time. He was quieter, more watchful. He spent hours running or working out in the small gym he'd set up in her garage. When she'd asked him about his plans, he'd just shrugged and said he needed time to figure things out. The sound of breaking glass snapped Sarah back to the present. One of the outlaws, a woman with a snake tattoo coiling up her neck, had smashed her car's side mirror with what looked like a tire iron. The crash echoed through the parking lot, causing several people to jump. Sarah's heart was pounding now, but years of emergency room experience kept her outwardly calm. "Sarah, honey, don't go out there," Mrs. Henderson pleaded, grabbing her arm as she took a step toward the door. "Wait for the police." But Sarah knew she couldn't just stand there and watch. That car represented years of hard work, of night shifts and overtime, of sacrificing weekends and holidays to care for others. It wasn't just transportation, it was independence, responsibility, everything. She'd worked for since nursing school. Besides, she thought grimly, these people needed to understand that they couldn't just terrorize healthcare workers who were just trying to do their jobs. Dr. Thompson, the chief of emergency medicine, appeared beside her. "Matthews, don't even think about it," he said firmly, reading her intention in her stance. "Security's on their way. Let them handle this." Sarah nodded, but her mind was already racing. Nathan had always told her that situational awareness was crucial, knowing not just what was happening, but what could happen next. She studied the Outlaws through the glass, noting details almost unconsciously. The leader's expensive custom, bike, the way the others deferred to him. The woman with the snake tattoo, her movements precise and practiced with the tire iron. The youngest member of the group, barely more than a kid really, trying too hard to prove himself with exaggerated swagger. A memory surfaced, Nathan teaching her self-defense moves in her backyard during his last visit home. "It's not about size or strength," he'd told her, demonstrating a simple wrist lock. "It's about awareness, about reading people and situations." He'd made her practice until she could do it without thinking, his patience never wavering even. When she got frustrated, the Outlaws were getting bolder now, encouraged by the lack of resistance. The leader had pulled out a knife and was using it to scratch something into her car's paint. The others were cheering him on, their voices carrying clearly through the morning air. Sarah could make out crude words and symbols appearing on her car's surface, each stroke of the knife making her flinch internally. More hospital staff had gathered in the lobby now, watching the scene unfold with a mix of concern and helpless anger. Sarah could hear them whispering, some suggesting they should all go out together to confront the vandals, others arguing for waiting for the authorities. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a scalpel. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket, her morning alarm reminding her that her shift was about to start. In less than 15 minutes, she would need to be changing into her scrubs, checking on patients, ready to handle whatever emergencies came through those doors. But right now, all she could do was watch as these outlaws systematically destroyed her property. Their actions, a direct challenge to the peace and safety of the hospital environment she dedicated her life to maintaining. The outlaws had spread out around Sarah's car, each taking turns adding their own mark of destruction. The leader, who the others called Razor, continued his methodical defacement of the hood, his knife carving crude symbols into the paint. The morning sun caught the blade's edge, sending sharp glints of light through the hospital's glass doors. The woman with the snake tattoo, they called her Viper, had moved to the trunk, using her tire iron to methodically dent the metal. The youngest member of the group, a lanky kid with a patchy beard who couldn't have been more than 20, was filming everything on his phone. His nervous laughter carried across the parking lot as he circled the scene, capturing every moment of destruction. The fourth member, a hulking man with arms covered in faded prison tattoos, stood watch, his massive frame deliberately positioned to intimidate anyone who might think of intervening. "Look at this," Razor called out, gesturing to the Nurses Save Lives bumper sticker with his knife. "Ain't that precious? Bet she thinks she's some kind of hero." He spat on the ground next to the car, then used his knife to begin peeling the sticker off, leaving long scratches in the bumper beneath it. Inside the hospital, Sarah felt each new act of vandalism like a physical blow. Her car wasn't just transportation, it was filled with memories. The small dent in the passenger door from when her brother had borrowed it during his last leave and accidentally backed into a pole. The pine-scented air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror, a Christmas gift from one of her elderly patients. The emergency medical kit in the trunk that had helped her save a life when she'd come across a motorcycle accident last summer. More hospital staff had gathered in the lobby now, their faces reflecting a mix of anger and helplessness. Dr. Thompson was on his phone again, his voice tight with frustration as he tried to hurry along the police response. Mrs. Henderson had tears in her eyes as she watched the destruction unfold, her hands clutched together in distress. "Sarah," a voice called softly from behind her. It was Maria Rodriguez, one of the ER nurses who'd worked alongside Sarah for the past 3 years. "I can give you a ride home after your shift, or you can borrow my car if you need it." The offer was kind, but it didn't ease the knot of anger growing in Sarah's chest. Outside, Viper had moved to the driver's side window, raising her tire iron with clear intent. The sound of breaking glass shattered the morning quiet, followed by hoots and cheers from her companions. Shards of safety glass scattered across the asphalt like diamonds in the early morning light. "Hey!" A new voice cut through the chaos. Charlie Weber, one of the hospital's janitors, had emerged from a side entrance. He was in his 60s, white-haired and slight, but his voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades keeping order in these halls. "That's enough! The police are on their way!" The outlaws turned toward him, their postures shifting from destructive glee to predatory focus. Razor pointed his knife in Charlie's direction, the blade catching the light. "Old man, you'd better get back inside before you get hurt. This ain't your business." Charlie stood his ground, his mop still in his hands. "This is a hospital. Everything that happens here is my business. You're disturbing our patients, destroying property, and acting like common thugs. Is that really who you want to be?" For a moment, there was silence. Then Razor's laugh cut through, the air harsh and mocking. He gestured to the hulking man with the prison tattoos. "Brick, why don't you show our friend here what happens to people who don't mind their own business?" Brick started moving toward Charlie, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the parking lot. Sarah felt her heart jump into her throat. Charlie was no match for the outlaw. None of them were. The old janitor seemed to realize this, too, taking a step backward, even as he kept his mop raised like a staff. "That's right," Razor called out, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Run back inside, old man. This is our playground now." The situation was spiraling out of control. Sarah could see more phones coming out among the gathered hospital staff, recording the scene. Someone mentioned that a local news van had been spotted heading their way. The outlaws seemed to feed off the attention, their actions becoming more theatrical, more deliberately provocative. Viper had climbed onto the hood of Sarah's car now, her boots leaving deep dents in the metal as she posed for the youngest member's phone camera. She was using her tire iron to smash the windshield in a rhythmic pattern, each impact sending a spiderweb of cracks across the glass. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the parking lot and highlighting the extent of the destruction. Sarah's car, which had started the morning as a humble but reliable vehicle, now looked like it had been through a war zone. Deep scratches covered every panel, windows were shattered, mirrors hung limply from their mounts, and crude symbols and words had been carved into every surface. But something was changing in the air, a new tension, different from the helpless fear of before. Maybe it was the way the wind had picked up, carrying with it the distant sound of sirens. Maybe it was the growing crowd of hospital staff, their collective anger beginning to outweigh their individual fear. Or maybe it was something else entirely, a shift in the morning light, a change in the atmosphere that spoke of approaching consequences. What the outlaws didn't know, couldn't know, was that at that very moment, Nathan Matthews was completing his morning run, heading back toward his sister's house, where he would soon find an urgent text message about what was happening at St. Mary's. They couldn't know that years of combat training had honed his protective instincts to a razor's edge, or that the skills he'd learned in the world's most dangerous places were about to be put to use in a hospital parking lot in small-town America. Nathan Matthews moved through his morning routine with the precision of someone who had spent years living by the clock. 5 miles into his run, his breathing was steady, measured, each footfall landing with purpose on the quiet streets of Pine Ridge. The sun had fully risen now, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold, but Nathan barely noticed the beauty around him. His mind was elsewhere, processing, planning, always alert. At 34, Nathan carried himself with the controlled grace of a predator. His dark hair was still regulation short, his face clean-shaven, his body hardened by years of training and combat. The scars on his arms and torso told stories he never shared, each one a reminder of missions that would remain classified for decades to come. 12 years with the SEALs had left their mark on him, not just physically, but in the way he moved, the way he observed, the way he calculated every situation. Living with Sarah these past few weeks had been an adjustment. After years of operating in war zones, the quiet of Pine Ridge felt almost oppressive. He'd wake up at dawn, his body still on military time, and spend hours running or working out in the garage gym he'd set up. Sarah worried about him. He could see it in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. But how could he explain? That civilian life felt like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. His phone buzzed in the armband strapped to his bicep. Nathan ignored it at first, focused on maintaining his pace. Then it buzzed again and again, the pattern he'd set up for emergency contacts. He slowed to a stop, his muscles cooling in the morning air as he pulled out the phone. 3 messages from Sarah, each marked urgent. The first message made his jaw clench. Outlaws in hospital parking lot. The second sent a surge of controlled anger through his system. They're destroying my car. The third was a live location pin to St. Mary's Hospital. Nathan's training kicked in immediately. He calculated his position, about 2 miles from the hospital. His body was warm from the run, ready for action. He knew the layout of the hospital grounds intimately, having dropped Sarah off for countless shifts. His mind began processing tactical approaches, entry points, potential scenarios. As he started moving toward the hospital, his pace quickened from a jog to a controlled run. Nathan's thoughts turned to Sarah. His sister had always been the strong one, the steady one. While he was deployed, she was the anchor that kept him connected to home. Her letters and care packages had been a lifeline during the darkest missions. She'd put herself through nursing school, worked double shifts to make ends meet, and never complained about the path she'd chosen. The sound of distant sirens caught his attention, police responding, but they'd be coming from the station across town. Traffic would slow them down. Nathan picked up his pace, his breathing still controlled despite the increased speed. His mind flashed back to his last deployment, to missions where timing had meant the difference between life and death. Pine Ridge was supposed to be different. It was supposed to be the quiet place where he could decompress, figure out his next move. Sarah had offered him her couch without hesitation when he'd returned, not asking questions about the nightmares that sometimes woke him, or why he spent hours staring at nothing. She understood that some wounds weren't visible, that some battles continued long after the shooting stopped. Now, as he ran through the morning streets, Nathan felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the heightened awareness that had kept him alive in combat zones. His senses sharpened, taking in every detail of his surroundings, the number of cars on the road, potential choke points, civilian presence. The weight of his phone felt like a tactical radio in his hand, Sarah's messages like mission coordinates. The hospital was just ahead now. He could see the parking lot, could make out a group of motorcycles clustered around what he recognized as Sarah's blue Honda. His pace didn't change, but his mind shifted into a higher gear, assessing the situation. With military precision, 4 targets, armed with improvised weapons, civilian presence, multiple entry points to the area. Nathan's muscles were loose, ready. Years of training had taught him to channel adrenaline into focus, to use anger as fuel rather than letting it control him. The outlaws wouldn't see him as a threat at first, just another runner in workout clothes. That was an advantage he'd used before, in places where blending in had meant survival. As he approached the hospital grounds, Nathan could see the destruction more clearly. Sarah's car was nearly unrecognizable, covered in scratches and dents, its windows shattered. The sight made something cold and hard settle in his chest. These weren't soldiers or insurgents. They were bullies who thought they could terrorize his sister, his community, without consequences. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as Nathan moved closer, his footsteps silent. Now his breathing controlled. Through the hospital's glass doors, he could see staff gathered, watching helplessly. Somewhere in that crowd was Sarah, probably worried sick about him showing up, probably hoping he wouldn't do anything rash. But Nathan Matthews hadn't spent 12 years as a Navy SEAL to stand by while thugs terrorized his family. He'd faced down worse threats in worse places, and he'd done it without the burning motivation of protecting his sister. The outlaws had chosen the wrong car, the wrong nurse, the wrong family to mess with. They just didn't know it yet. The outlaws had formed a loose circle around Sarah's car, their attention focused on their destruction rather than their surroundings. Razor stood atop the crumpled hood, performing for his audience, while Viper continued her methodical damage to the remaining windows. The youngest member live-streamed everything on his phone, providing running commentary punctuated by nervous laughter. Brick, the massive enforcer, kept watch with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never met a real challenge. None of them noticed Nathan's approach. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, each step calculated, his presence barely registering in their peripheral vision. He'd learned this skill in places where being seen meant death, had perfected, enduring missions that would never appear in any official record. Now, in a hospital parking lot in Pine Ridge, those same skills served a different purpose. "Hey!" Nathan called out, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made people stop and listen. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the morning air, like a knife. "That's my sister's car." The outlaws turned, their reactions varying from annoyed to amused. Razor looked down from his perch on the hood, his knife catching the sunlight. "Well, well," he sneered. "Looks like little sister called in the cavalry. What are you supposed to be, buddy? The morning jogger patrol?" Nathan stood perfectly still, his posture relaxed but alert. He was aware of everything. The distance between each outlaw, the weapons they carried, the growing crowd of onlookers at the hospital entrance. His eyes scanned each target, noting details that most people would miss. The way Brick shifted his weight, telegraphing his intentions. The slight tremor in the young filmmaker's hands, betraying his nervousness. "I'm going to give you one chance," Nathan said, his voice steady. "Leave now. Forget about the car. Forget about this hospital. Just go." Laughter erupted from the group, but it was forced, uncertain. Something about the way Nathan stood, the way he spoke, had planted a seed of doubt in their minds. Viper's grip tightened on her tire iron, her knuckles white against the metal. The young live streamer had stopped his commentary, his phone wavering. As he filmed, "One chance," Razor repeated, his voice dripping with mock surprise. "Did you hear that, boys? The jogger's giving us a chance." He jumped down from the hood, landing with exaggerated flair. "Listen, friend, I don't know who you think you are, but you're about to learn a painful lesson about minding your own business." Nathan didn't move, didn't flinch. His eyes remained fixed on Razor, but his awareness extended to every movement around him. He could hear sirens in the distance, but they were still too far away. This would be over before they arrived. "Last warning," Nathan said quietly. "Walk away." Razor's face darkened. He gestured to Brick, a silent command that the massive enforcer understood immediately. Brick started forward, cracking his knuckles, a grin spreading across his face. He towered over Nathan, outweighing him by at least 50 pounds. "Show this." "Morning jogger, what happens when he interrupts our fun?" Razor called out, settling back to watch the show. Brick moved with the confidence of someone who'd won every fight through sheer size and strength. His first swing was telegraphed, powerful but slow. Nathan didn't actually move much, just a slight shift of his weight, a small turn of his body. Brick's fist met empty air, and suddenly he was off balance, stumbling forward. What happened next was almost too fast for the gathered crowd to follow. Nathan's hand shot out, grabbed Brick's extended arm, and with a twist and pivot that looked deceptively simple, the massive enforcer was airborne. He crashed onto the pavement with a thud that knocked the wind from his lungs, his expression switching from confidence to confusion to pain in rapid succession. The parking lot went silent. Even the young live streamer's running commentary stopped mid-sentence. Viper's tire iron hung loose in her grip, her snake tattoo seeming to writhe. As she swallowed hard, Razor's sneer had been replaced by something closer to concern. "What the hell?" the young filmmaker whispered, his phone still recording. "What just happened?" Nathan hadn't moved from his spot, hadn't even broken a sweat. His breathing remained steady, his posture still relaxed but ready. Brick lay on the ground, trying to process how he'd ended up there, his reputation crumbling as quickly as his confidence. "Like I said," Nathan spoke into the silence, "that's my sister's car, and you've made a serious mistake." Through the hospital's glass doors, Sarah watched with a mixture of pride and concern. She'd seen Nathan train, knew what he was capable of, but this was different. This was her quiet, reserved brother showing a side of himself that Pine Ridge had never seen. The gathered hospital staff whispered among themselves, phones recording, as the morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, where an unexpected confrontation was about to escalate. Razor's confident demeanor cracked slightly as he watched his enforcer struggle to get up from the pavement. Brick's face was a mask of confusion and embarrassment, his usual intimidating presence diminished by how easily he'd been taken down. The young filmmaker had stopped providing commentary, his phone shaking slightly as he continued to record, capturing every moment of the unexpected turn of events. "Who the hell are you?" Razor demanded, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. His hand tightened on his knife, the blade catching the morning light. The swagger in his stance had diminished, replaced by something more cautious, more calculating. Nathan remained perfectly still, his breathing steady, his eyes constantly moving between the four outlaws. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost conversational. Just a brother looking out for his sister, the same sister who might have ended up treating you in that ER if you'd ever gotten hurt, the same sister who spent the last 5 years saving, lives while you've been out here destroying things. Viper moved first, her tire iron raised as she tried to circle behind Nathan. Her movements were practiced, suggesting she'd done this before, but to Nathan's trained eye, she might as well have been telegraphing her intentions with flashing lights. He shifted slightly, maintaining awareness of all four threats while appearing to focus only on Razor. "Look," Razor said, trying to regain control of the situation. "Maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. We were just having some fun, that's all. No real harm done." But his eyes betrayed him, darting between Nathan and the knife in his hand, calculating odds that suddenly seemed less favorable. Inside the hospital, the crowd had grown. Sarah stood at the front, her hands pressed against the glass doors, watching her brother with a mixture of pride and fear. She'd seen him like this only once before, during a bar fight when he was home on leave. That incident had ended quickly, with three would-be troublemakers apologizing profusely before practically running away. No real harm? Nathan's voice carried an edge now, sharp as a razor. You vandalized my sister's car, terrorized hospital staff, disturbed patients. And you filmed it all, didn't you? He glanced at the young filmmaker, who instinctively took a step back. That's quite a record you've created of your crimes. Brick had managed to get to his feet, his massive frame unsteady, pride wounded more than his body. He looked to Razor for direction, but the leader's attention was fixed on Nathan, trying to understand what they were dealing with. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the parking lot, highlighting the destruction they'd caused to Sarah's car, making it impossible to deny or minimize their actions. "Listen, man," the young filmmaker spoke up, his voice cracking slightly. "We can delete the video. No harm, no foul, right?" His phone was still recording, though, capturing every moment of their increasing uncertainty. Nathan's eyes flickered to the hospital entrance, where he could see Sarah watching. Their eyes met briefly, a lifetime of shared understanding passing between them. She gave him a small nod, trusting him to handle the situation. He'd protected her since they were kids, and nothing had changed. "Here's what's going to happen," Nathan said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "You're going to leave. Now. You're going to forget about this hospital, forget about my sister's car, forget about Pine Ridge entirely. Because if you don't, if I ever see any of you around here again..." He let the threat hang in the air, unspoken but clear. Viper had lowered her tire iron slightly, her confidence wavering. The snake tattoo on her neck seemed to writhe as she swallowed hard, reading something in Nathan's stance that spoke of real danger. She'd been in enough fights to recognize when someone knew what they were doing, and everything about this man screamed professional. "And the video?" Razor asked, trying to maintain some semblance of control. "What about that?" "The video stays," Nathan replied coolly. "Evidence has a way of keeping people honest. Think of it as insurance that you'll make the right decision and never come back here." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. The distant sound of sirens was growing closer, but they all knew this would be resolved before the police arrived. It had to be. The Outlaws exchanged glances, their earlier bravado replaced by the dawning realization that they'd picked the wrong target, the wrong place, the wrong fight. Brick took a step back, then another, his massive frame no longer projecting the intimidation it had earlier. The young filmmaker's hand had dropped to his side, though his phone continued recording, capturing what had become a very different kind of video than what they'd planned. Razor made one final attempt to salvage his authority, his knife glinting in the morning sun. "You think you can take all of us?" he challenged, but his voice lacked conviction. The once confident leader was beginning to realize that the situation had spiraled far beyond his control. "There's 4 of us. 1 of you." Nathan's response was a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Numbers don't mean much when you don't know what you're doing. The question isn't whether I can take all of you. It's how many of you want to end up in my sister's ER." The parking lot had become eerily quiet, the only sounds being the distant sirens and the low rumble of the Outlaws' idling motorcycles. The morning sun cast harsh shadows that seemed to emphasize the destruction they'd wrought on Sarah's car, making their actions look even more malicious in the clear light of day. "We've handled tough guys before," Viper spoke up, but her voice wavered slightly. She tried to project confidence, adjusting her grip on the tire iron, but her eyes kept darting to Brick, who was still trying to recover his dignity after being so easily dispatched. "No," Nathan said quietly. "You haven't. Not like me." His stance shifted almost imperceptibly, but the movement carried such lethal promise that both Viper and the young filmmaker took involuntary steps backward. What you've handled are ordinary people, civilians, people who were afraid of you. I'm not afraid. I've seen things that would give your nightmares nightmares. Inside the hospital, the gathered crowd had grown larger. Word had spread quickly, through the building, about the confrontation outside, about the quiet brother who had appeared like an avenging angel to challenge the outlaws. Sarah remained at the front, watching intently, recognizing in her brother's stance the same controlled power she'd glimpsed during his rare visits home between deployments. Razor made his decision suddenly, lunging forward with his knife in a movement that might have worked on an unsuspecting victim. But Nathan was neither unsuspecting nor a victim. He moved with fluid grace, seeming to flow around the blade like water. In one smooth motion, he caught Razor's wrist, twisted, and suddenly the knife was clattering across the pavement, spinning. Away under a parked car, Razor found himself on his knees, his arm locked behind his back at an angle that promised agony if he struggled. Nathan held him there with seemingly minimal effort, his breathing still calm and measured. The other outlaws froze, watching their leader being controlled with such ease. "That was stupid," Nathan said, his voice still conversational. "But then you've been making stupid decisions all morning, haven't you?" He applied slightly more pressure, causing Razor to gasp. "Coming to a hospital to cause trouble, vandalizing a nurse's car, acting tough in front of your friends, all of it stupid." The young filmmaker's phone captured everything, his hand now steady as he documented their humiliation. Viper's tire iron hung loose at her side, all thoughts of using it forgotten. As she watched their leader being systematically dismantled, Brick stood with his massive hands open at his sides, any desire to prove himself thoroughly extinguished. Okay, Razor gasped, his face contorted in pain. "We'll leave, just let me go." Nathan maintained the hold for a moment longer, letting the message sink in. "When I release you," he said quietly, "you're going to get on your bike. You're going to tell your friends to do the same, and you're going to ride out of here, knowing that if you ever come back, if you ever cause trouble at this hospital again, what happens next won't be nearly as gentle." The morning air was thick with tension as Nathan slowly released his hold. Razor scrambled to his feet, rubbing his wrist, his face a mask of humiliation and barely contained rage. But there was fear there too, real fear, the kind that comes from encountering something you don't understand and can't control. The gathered hospital staff watched in silence as the outlaw leader backed away from Nathan, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. The other gang members were already moving toward their bikes, their movements quick and nervous, like prey animals sensing a predator in their midst. "This isn't over," Razor tried to growl, but the words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. "Yes," Nathan replied simply, "it is." His tone carried such quiet certainty that even Razor couldn't find a response. The outlaw leader looked around at his companions, at the crowd of witnesses, at the phone still recording everything, and realized just how completely the situation had turned against them. The outlaws mounted their motorcycles with none of the swagger they'd shown earlier. Razor's hands shook slightly as he gripped his handlebars, his earlier confidence shattered by the encounter. Viper tossed her tire iron aside, the metal clattering across the parking lot as she swung her leg over her bike. The young filmmaker finally lowered his phone, but not before capturing their inglorious retreat. Brick, the massive enforcer who had been so easily defeated, struggled to maintain any semblance of dignity as he mounted his motorcycle. His usual intimidating presence had been reduced to something almost pitiful, like a schoolyard bully who'd finally met real resistance. The morning sun seemed to mock their retreat, highlighting every dent and scratch they'd inflicted on Sarah's car, every mark of their senseless destruction. "Remember what I said," Nathan called out as they started their engines. "This hospital is off limits. My sister is off limits. Spread the word to any other outlaws who might get similar ideas." His voice carried easily over the rumble of their Bikes, each word weighted with unspoken threat. The crowd at the hospital entrance had grown even larger. Nurses, doctors, orderlies, and patients gathered to watch the conclusion of the confrontation. Sarah stepped outside for the first time since the ordeal began, moving to stand beside her brother. Her presence seemed to add another layer of meaning to the moment, the healer and the warrior, sister and brother, standing united against those who would bring chaos to their community. Razor revved his engine, trying to salvage some small piece of his reputation with the noise. "You got lucky today," he shouted over the roar, but his words lacked conviction. "Next time?" "There won't be a next time," Nathan cut him off, his voice carrying that same quiet certainty that had marked his every word. "You're done here. The video your friend took, it's evidence now. Every mark you made on that car, every threat you made, it's all recorded. Walk away while you still can." The young filmmaker's phone had captured everything, their arrival, their vandalism, their humiliation. The evidence was undeniable, their actions documented in high definition. They all knew that video would circulate, destroying whatever fearsome reputation they'd built. In trying to prove their toughness, they'd only succeeded in proving their weakness. Mrs. Henderson emerged from the hospital, phone in hand. "The police are almost here," she announced, her voice carrying across the parking lot. 2 minutes. Out, they say. She gave the Outlaws a look that contained more disappointment than fear. "You might want to be gone before they arrive." The mention of police seemed to finally break through the last of their hesitation. Razor led the retreat, his custom bike roaring as he pulled away. The others followed, their formation ragged and uncoordinated, nothing like the intimidating arrival they'd made earlier. The young filmmaker was last, his phone making one final sweep of the scene before he too disappeared. As the sound of their motorcycles faded into the distance, a collective breath seemed to be released by everyone present. Hospital staff began to emerge from the building, gathering around Sarah's car to assess the damage. The morning sun highlighted every scratch, every dent, every mark of senseless destruction the Outlaws had inflicted. "I'm so sorry about your car," Mrs. Henderson said, placing a gentle hand on Sarah's arm. "But we're all so grateful you weren't hurt. And your brother—" She trailed off, looking at Nathan with newfound respect. Nathan remained alert, his eyes scanning the direction the Outlaws had disappeared. Years of training had taught him that retreat didn't always mean surrender, that threats sometimes returned when you least expected them. But something told him these particular Outlaws had learned their lesson. They'd come looking for easy targets, and instead found something they couldn't handle. Sarah surveyed her damaged car, her expression a mix of sadness and resolution. "It's just a car," she said finally. "It can be fixed. What matters is that they won't be back. They won't be terrorizing anyone else at this hospital." The distant wail of police sirens was growing closer, but they would arrive too late to do anything except take statements and photographs. The real resolution had come through Nathan's intervention, through the quiet strength that had turned the Outlaws' attempted show of force into a humbling retreat. Hospital security finally arrived, looking somewhat sheepish about their delayed response. The morning shift was changing, staff members arriving to find themselves part of the aftermath of an incident that would undoubtedly become hospital legend. Already, people were sharing videos they'd taken through the glass doors, spreading the story of the nurse's brother who had stood up to the Outlaws. But Nathan wasn't interested in becoming a legend. His focus remained on his sister, on ensuring her safety, on protecting the community she'd dedicated herself to serving. The skills he'd learned as a Navy SEAL had found a new purpose here in Pine Ridge, defending not just his family, but the principles of order and respect that made civil society possible. The police arrived in a chorus of sirens, their cruisers, pulling into the parking lot minutes after the Outlaws' retreat. Officer Mike Sullivan, a veteran of Pine Ridge's small police force, stepped out of his vehicle and surveyed the scene with practiced eyes. The damage to Sarah's car told its own story. Scratches deep in the paint, shattered windows, dents in the metal that would cost thousands to repair. "Miss Matthews," Sullivan addressed Sarah, his notebook already in hand, "want to tell me what happened here?" His eyes flickered to Nathan, noting the younger man's alert stance and controlled demeanor. There was something familiar about it, something he recognized from his own military service years ago. Sarah began recounting the events, her voice steady despite the lingering tension. Hospital staff gathered around, adding details to her narrative, her phones appearing to show videos of the confrontation. Officer Sullivan listened carefully, his pen moving across the pages as he documented everything. "And you are?" he asked Nathan, though something in his expression suggested he already had an idea. "Nathan Matthews," Nathan replied simply. "Sarah's brother. I was out for a run when she texted me about the situation." He didn't elaborate on his military background or how he'd handled the Outlaws. Some things didn't need to be said out loud. Sullivan nodded, understanding passing between the two men. "The Blackhawks," he said, referring to the outlaw gang. "They've been causing trouble up and down the coast. Nothing this bold before, though. Targeting a hospital." He shook his head, disgust evident in his expression. Dr. Thompson stepped forward, his usual composed demeanor slightly ruffled by the morning's events. "We want to press charges," he stated firmly. "This kind of behavior cannot go unchallenged. We have video evidence, multiple witnesses. These people need to learn there are consequences for their actions." Sarah looked at her car again, running her hand along one of the deep scratches in the hood. The morning sun highlighted every mark, every act of senseless destruction. "Will insurance cover this?" she wondered aloud, more to herself than anyone else. "Don't worry about that right now," Nathan said quietly. "We'll figure it out." His eyes hadn't stopped scanning the surroundings, a habit ingrained by years of training and combat experience. Even now, with the immediate threat gone, he remained vigilant. Mrs. Henderson approached with a cup of coffee for Sarah, her motherly concern evident. "You should take the day off, dear," she suggested, "after everything that's happened." But Sarah shook her head. "My patients need me. I'm not letting those outlaws disrupt any more lives today." Her voice carried the same quiet strength that had marked her brother's confrontation with the gang. Different approaches to service, but the same underlying determination. Officer Sullivan finished taking statements and photographs, his expression growing grimmer with each new piece of evidence. "We'll put out an alert for them," he assured the gathered crowd. "With the video evidence, we should be able to identify and locate them fairly quickly. They won't get away with this." The morning shift was in full swing now, ambulances arriving, with new patients, staff changing over as the hospital's rhythm continued despite the disruption. Sarah's damaged car had become a symbol of something larger, the vulnerability of those who served others and the community's response to threats against their own. Nathan watched as hospital security finally began setting up a perimeter around Sarah's car, marking it off with yellow tape for the insurance investigators who would arrive later. His morning run felt like it had happened days ago, though barely an hour had passed since Sarah's first urgent text. "You didn't have to do this," Sarah said softly, standing beside him, "but I'm glad you were here." Nathan's expression softened slightly, though his alertness didn't waver. "I'll always be here when you need me, sis. That's what family does." He paused, watching as more police officers arrived to gather evidence. Besides, someone needed to show those outlaws that not everyone is afraid of them. A young nurse approached them hesitantly, her phone in hand. "I got it all on video," she said, "from when they first arrived until they left. It's clear footage. You can see their faces, their bike licenses, everything." She looked at Nathan with a mix of admiration and curiosity. "The way you handled them. Are you military?" "Was," Nathan replied simply, leaving it at that. He had no interest in becoming a local hero or having his actions dissected by curious onlookers. What he'd done was necessary, nothing more. The morning sun had risen fully now, casting short shadows across the parking lot. Hospital staff began returning to their duties, though small groups lingered to discuss what they'd witnessed. The story was already spreading through Pine Ridge's gossip network, how a former Navy SEAL had stood up to the notorious Blackhawks, protecting not just his sister, but the entire hospital community. But Nathan's thoughts were already moving forward, calculating potential repercussions, planning for contingencies. The Outlaws had been humbled, but humiliation often bred revenge. He would need to stay vigilant, keep watch over Sarah and the hospital, ensure that today's victory didn't become tomorrow's renewed threat. The news of the confrontation spread through Pine Ridge like wildfire. By midday, videos of the incident had circulated on local social media, showing different angles of Nathan's calm dismantling of the outlaw gang's intimidation tactics. The hospital parking lot had become a minor tourist attraction, with people driving by slowly to look at Sarah's damaged car, which still sat surrounded by police tape. Inside the ER, Sarah worked her shift with her usual dedication, though her colleagues noticed she checked her phone more frequently than usual. Word had reached them about scattered sightings of other Blackhawk members in neighboring towns, but none had dared approach Pine Ridge again. Nathan's warning, backed by his demonstrated abilities, seemed to have made an impression. "Your brother," Dr. Thompson said during a quiet moment between patients. "He's quite something. Military, isn't he?" The older doctor's eyes held a knowing look. His own son had served in Afghanistan, and he recognized the bearing, the controlled presence that marked someone who'd seen combat. Sarah nodded, checking a patient's chart. "Navy SEAL, 12 years. He doesn't talk about it much." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "He's been staying with me since he got back, trying to figure out what comes next." "Well," Thompson replied, "after this morning, I'd say he's found his calling. We could use someone like him here. Hospital security has been understaffed for months. The board would approve a new position in a heartbeat, especially after today." The suggestion caught Sarah by surprise. Nathan had been struggling to find his place in civilian life, caught between his military training and the peaceful routines of Pine Ridge. A role protecting the hospital, ensuring the safety of medical staff and patients. It made a certain kind of sense. Outside in the parking lot, insurance adjusters had arrived to assess the damage to Sarah's car. They walked around the vehicle, taking photographs and notes, their expressions growing increasingly grim. The destruction was comprehensive. Not a single panel had been left unmarked, not a window left unbroken. The Nurses Save Lives bumper sticker lay in shreds on the ground, a particular target of the Outlaws' spite. Nathan watched the proceedings from a distance, his morning run long forgotten. He'd changed into fresh clothes that Sarah kept at the hospital for emergencies, but his alertness hadn't diminished. Every motorcycle sound made him scan the street. Every group of leather-clad riders drew his attention. "Mr. Matthews?" A voice interrupted his surveillance. It was Officer Sullivan, returning with additional questions. "We've identified most of the Blackhawks from the video footage. Roy Razor, Tillman, their leader. He's got a record. Assault, vandalism, intimidation. Been operating up and down the coast for years, but no one's been able to make charges stick. Witnesses always seem to disappear before court dates." Nathan absorbed this information without comment, but his jaw tightened slightly. He understood the implications. The Blackhawks maintained their power through fear, ensuring that victims were too scared to testify. But they'd made a mistake this time. They'd attacked someone under his protection, and he had no intention of backing down. "The DA wants to talk to you," Sullivan continued. "Your testimony, combined with the video evidence, we might finally have a chance to shut them down for good. But—" he hesitated. There might be blowback. These guys don't take kindly to people who stand up to them. Let them try, Nathan replied quietly, his voice carrying an edge that made Sullivan take a small step back. They wanted to send a message this morning. Well, I sent one back. The hospital is off limits. My sister is off limits. If they haven't learned that lesson yet, I'm happy to teach it again. The officer nodded, understanding. He'd seen enough combat veterans to recognize that Nathan wasn't making idle threats. The quiet confidence, the controlled power. This was someone who had faced far worse than a gang of local troublemakers. Throughout the day, hospital staff stopped by to check on Zara, offering support and sharing their own perspectives on the morning's events. Many had stories about previous encounters with the Blackhawks, intimidation at local businesses, harassment on the roads, the subtle threat of violence that had become part of life in the coastal communities they frequented. But something had changed. The videos spreading across social media showed more than just a confrontation. They showed that the Outlaws weren't invincible, that someone had finally stood up to their bullying and won. The mystique of fear they'd built around themselves had been shattered by one man who refused to be intimidated. Mrs. Henderson, watching the insurance adjuster's work, summed it up best. Sometimes it just takes one person willing to say, "Enough." One person to show that they're not as tough as they pretend to be. She looked at Nathan with grandmotherly approval. Your sister has been taking care of this community for years. Now you're doing the same thing, just in a different way. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, highlighting the evidence of the morning's confrontation. But amidst the destruction, there was a sense of change in the air. The hospital staff walked with a bit more confidence, knowing they had an unexpected guardian in their midst. The Blackhawks' attempt to terrorize had backfired, transforming their target into a symbol of resistance against their bullying tactics. A week after the confrontation, life at St. Mary's Hospital had settled into a new normal. Sarah's damaged car had been towed away, replaced by a temporary rental, while insurance processed the claim. The parking lot had been cleaned up, broken glass swept away, but the memory of that morning remained fresh in everyone's minds. The incident had changed things in subtle but significant ways. Nathan had accepted Dr. Thompson's offer to join the hospital security team, though on his own terms. He'd spent the week analyzing the facility's vulnerabilities, developing new protocols, and training the existing security staff. His military experience brought a level of professionalism and preparation that the hospital had never seen before. "You see that entrance?" he explained to the security team during a morning briefing. "It needs coverage from multiple angles. In a hospital, you're not just protecting against obvious threats. You're securing entry points, monitoring suspicious behavior, ensuring staff and patient safety 24/7. His quiet authority had transformed the previously casual security operation into something more structured, more effective. Sarah watched these changes with a mixture of pride and amazement. The brother who had struggled to find his place in civilian life seemed to have found a new purpose. His skills, honed in combat zones across the world, were being redirected to protect those who protected others. It made a kind of perfect sense. The Blackhawks hadn't been seen in Pine Ridge since that morning, but their absence hadn't gone unnoticed. Word had spread through the motorcycle community about what had happened, how a former Navy SEAL had single-handedly faced down the notorious gang. The story had grown in the telling, but the core truth remained. Someone had finally stood up to them and won. "Your brothers change things," Maria Rodriguez told Sarah during a quiet moment in the ER. "Not just here at the hospital. My cousin runs a shop downtown. Says the Blackhawks used to come through every few weeks, making trouble. Now, nothing. They're staying away." She paused, checking a patient's vitals. "It's like the whole town can breathe easier." The DA's investigation into the Blackhawks was proceeding, backed by the video evidence from that morning. Other victims had begun coming forward, emboldened by the hospital incident. The gang's intimidation tactics, which had kept people silent for so long, were losing their power in the face of growing community resistance. Nathan took his new role seriously, approaching hospital security with the same dedication he'd brought to his military service. He installed new cameras, implemented emergency response protocols, and trained staff on situational awareness. But more than that, he became a quiet guardian of the hospital community, his presence alone deterring potential trouble. "It's not just about physical security," he explained to Sarah one evening after her shift. "It's about creating an environment where people feel safe to do their jobs. You can't help others if you're constantly looking over your shoulder." He'd been studying hospital security best practices, adapting his combat experience to this new mission. The news had picked up the story, running pieces about the former Navy SEAL who'd transformed a local hospital's security after standing up to a notorious biker gang. Nathan avoided the attention, declining interviews and staying focused on his work. But the story resonated with other communities dealing with similar issues, proving that resistance was possible. Sarah's damaged car had become a symbol of sorts. The insurance company had declared it a total loss. The repairs would have cost more than the vehicle was worth, but local businesses had stepped forward, offering deals on a replacement. The community's response to the incident had shown that the Black Hawk's intimidation tactics had united people against them rather than cowering them into submission. "You know," Sarah said to Nathan as they walked through the hospital corridors, "during one of his security rounds, when you first came back, I was worried about you. You seemed lost, like you couldn't find your place in civilian life." She paused, watching him check security cameras and door locks with practiced efficiency. "But maybe this is exactly where you needed to be." Nathan nodded, his attention never fully leaving his surveillance. In the SEALs, everything was about the mission, protecting others, maintaining security, being ready for anything. This isn't so different. He adjusted a camera angle slightly. Just a different kind of battlefield. The hospital staff had embraced Nathan's presence, quickly learning to appreciate the quiet competence he brought to their safety. Nurses felt more secure walking to their cars after late shifts, knowing that new security protocols were in place. Even patients seemed to sense the change, the atmosphere of the hospital becoming more peaceful despite the constant flow of emergencies and trauma. "Your brother," Dr. Thompson told Sarah during a staff meeting, "he's brought more than just security, expertise. He's brought peace of mind in healthcare. That's invaluable." The other staff members nodded in agreement, understanding that their workplace had been transformed by the unexpected arrival of a warrior who'd found a new way to serve. 1 month after the confrontation in the hospital parking lot, Sarah Matthews stood beside her new car, a silver Honda Civic, slightly newer than her previous one. The nurse's Save Lives bumper sticker had been replaced, this time accompanied by a small decal of a Navy SEAL trident that Nathan had given her. The morning sun caught the fresh paint, unmarred by scratches or dents, a symbol of renewal and resilience. The hospital had changed in subtle but significant ways. New security cameras watched over the parking lot, their presence both reassuring and deterring. Nathan's influence could be seen in the improved lighting, the regular security, patrols, and the confident stride of staff members arriving for their shifts. What had started as a response to one incident had evolved into a comprehensive transformation of hospital security. "Your brother's a hero," Mrs. Henderson often said, though Nathan always deflected such praise. He wasn't interested in accolades or recognition. For him, protecting the hospital and its staff was simply another mission, no different from his time in the SEALs. He approached it with the same quiet dedication, the same unwavering focus. The DA's case against the Blackhawks was proceeding steadily. Roy Razor Tillman and his gang had been formally charged with multiple counts of vandalism, intimidation, and assault. The video evidence from that morning, combined with testimony from other victims who'd finally found the courage to come forward, had built a strong case. The gang's reign of terror along the coast was coming to an end, not with a dramatic confrontation, but through the steady application of law and justice. "It's not just about one incident," Officer Sullivan explained during a follow-up visit to the hospital. "What happened here opened the floodgates. People started talking, sharing their stories. The Blackhawks aren't so intimidating anymore." He glanced at Nathan, who was conducting his routine security check nearby. "Sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to stand up to them." Sarah's work in the ER continued, but now with an added sense of security. Her brother's presence had become a familiar part of hospital life, his quiet vigilance as much a part of the routine as the beeping of monitors or the squeak of nurses' shoes on polished floors. He'd found his place in the civilian world, not by abandoning his military training, but by adapting it to protect those who protected others. "You know what I realized?" Sarah said to Nathan one evening as they walked through the hospital corridors. "We're not so different, you and I. I save lives in the ER, you save lives by preventing trouble before it starts. Different methods, same goal." Nathan had simply nodded, but she could see the understanding in his eyes. The story of the Navy SEAL who'd stood up to the outlaw gang had spread beyond Pine Ridge, inspiring other communities to take a stand against intimidation and violence. Local news stations had run features on hospital security, using St. Mary's as an example of how one person could catalyze positive change. Nathan avoided the cameras, but his impact was undeniable. "Sometimes the best victories are the quiet ones," he told Sarah when she asked about his reluctance to be interviewed. "The fights that never happen because people know better. The threats that never materialize because security is visible and effective." It was a philosophy born of his military experience, where prevention was often more valuable than confrontation. The hospital board had officially created a new position for Nathan, Director of Security Operations. It was a role that allowed him to implement comprehensive security measures while training others in the skills he'd learned through years of service. He approached it with the same dedication he'd brought to his military career, understanding that the stakes were just as high. "Your brother," Dr. Thompson remarked to Sarah during a quiet moment in the ER, "he's done more than just improve security. He's shown that one person can make a difference, that standing up to bullies and protecting others is still worthwhile." He paused, watching Nathan conduct a security briefing with new staff members. That's a powerful message in today's world. The morning sun still rose over Pine Ridge, illuminating the hospital parking lot where it had all begun. But now, instead of highlighting destruction and intimidation, it revealed a transformed space. Secure, peaceful, protected. The incident that had started with an act of vandalism had led to something greater, a community's renewed confidence, a warrior's new purpose, and a sister's pride in her brother's continuing service. Sarah's new car stood as a testament to resilience and change, but it was more than just a replacement for what was lost. It represented the transformation that had occurred in the hospital, in the community, and in the lives of a nurse and her Navy SEAL brother who had found new ways to serve and protect. The bumper sticker and SEAL Trident decal caught the morning light, symbols of the different paths they'd chosen that had ultimately led them to the same place, standing guard over those who needed protection, each in their own way. The sound of motorcycles still occasionally echoed through Pine Ridge, but they no longer carried threats or intimidation. The Blackhawks' attempt to terrorize a small-town hospital had instead revealed the strength that comes from standing up to bullies, the power of community united against fear, and the unexpected ways that warriors can find new battlefields in the service of others. In the quiet, pre-dawn hours at St. Mary's Hospital, 3 months after the confrontation that had changed everything, Sarah Matthews and her brother Nathan sat sharing coffee in the staff break room. The early morning light was just beginning to filter through the windows, casting long shadows across the freshly polished floors. Sarah was finishing up a night shift in the ER, while Nathan was starting his morning security rounds. "Did you hear about the Blackhawks trial?" Sarah asked, warming her hands around her coffee cup. "Officer Sullivan stopped by last night. Razor. And the others took a plea deal. They're looking at serious time, plus restitution to all their victims." Nathan nodded, his eyes continuously scanning their surroundings, a habit that hadn't diminished despite the relative peace of the past months. Good. Actions have consequences. They needed to learn that. His voice was quiet, but carried the weight of someone who understood the true meaning of justice. The hospital had flourished under the new security protocols Nathan had implemented. Staff turnover had decreased significantly, and there was a noticeable increase in workplace satisfaction. The administration had even started receiving inquiries from other hospitals in the region, all wanting to know how St. Mary's had transformed its security so effectively. "Remember how scared everyone used to be about working night shifts?" Sarah mused, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "Now look at us. Last night we had 3 new nurses orientation for the overnight rotation. They all specifically requested it." Nathan allowed himself a small smile. The change hadn't just been in physical security, it was in the confidence of the staff, the atmosphere of safety that pervaded the hospital at all hours. His training as a SEAL had taught him that true security wasn't just about cameras and protocols. It was about creating an environment where people felt protected enough to focus on their vital work. A young security officer appeared in the doorway, standing at attention. "Director Matthews, the morning briefing is ready." Nathan had insisted on regular security briefings, sharing intelligence about potential threats and updating protocols as needed. It was another military practice he'd adapted for civilian use, and it had proven incredibly effective. "You know," Sarah said as Nathan stood to leave, "Mrs. Henderson was right that first day. Sometimes it just takes one person willing to stand up, to show others it's possible." She paused, looking at her brother with pride. "But it's what happens after that really matters. The changes you've made here, the difference you've made in people's lives. That's the real victory." Nathan gathered his papers, his movements, efficient and purposeful. "We all serve in our own ways, sis. You save lives in the ER. I make sure you can do that safely. It's that simple." But they both knew it wasn't simple at all. It was about finding purpose, about transforming military experience into civilian protection, about healing not just bodies, but the spirit of a community. The morning shift was arriving. Now staff members greeting Nathan with respectful nods as they passed. Many still remembered the day he'd stood alone against the Blackhawks, but they'd come to respect him more for what he'd done since then. The quiet, consistent work of building a safer environment for everyone. "Director Matthews," Dr. Thompson called out, hurrying down the corridor. "Got a minute? The board wants to discuss expanding our security program. Other hospitals in the network are interested in implementing your protocols." The older doctor's eyes gleamed with excitement. "They're talking about creating a regional training center here at St. Mary's." Nathan listened carefully, his mind already calculating the possibilities. A training center could help other hospitals protect their staff, could spread the methods he'd developed to benefit more communities. It was another way to serve, to use his skills for something bigger than himself. "I'll think about it," he replied, though Sarah could see the idea had already taken root. Her brother had found more than just a job at St. Mary's. He'd found a new mission, a way to continue serving while staying connected to family and community. As Nathan headed off to his morning briefing, Sarah gathered her belongings, ready to head home after her shift. Through the windows, she could see her new car in the parking lot, the morning sun glinting off its silver paint. The Nurses Save Lives sticker and Seal Trident decal caught the light, reminders of how different paths could lead to the same goal, protecting and serving others. The hospital was coming fully awake now, the quiet of night giving way to the controlled chaos of a new day. Emergency vehicles arrived with their lights flashing, families came to visit patients, and staff hurried through the corridors with purposeful strides. But there was an underlying sense of security, a confidence that hadn't existed before the day the Outlaws had made the mistake of targeting a nurse's car. In the security office, Nathan began his briefing, addressing a room full of attentive officers. His training methods combined military precision with civilian practicality, creating a security force that was both effective and approachable. On the walls, monitors displayed feeds from the new camera system, while detailed protocols and emergency procedures were posted prominently. Security isn't just about preventing threats, he told his team, echoing words he'd learned through years of military service. It's about creating an environment where healing can happen without fear. Every person who walks through those doors, patient, visitor, or staff, needs to know they're protected. The morning sun continued to rise over Pine Ridge, illuminating a hospital that had been transformed, not just by one dramatic confrontation, but by the quieter, deeper changes that had followed. The story of the Navy SEAL who'd stood up to outlaws had evolved into something more meaningful, a testament to how military service could find new expression in civilian life, how protection could take many forms, and how the bonds between siblings could strengthen an entire community. Sarah's car stood in the parking lot, no longer just a means of transportation, but a symbol of resilience and transformation. The incident that had begun with vandalism had led to something far more significant, a hospital where staff could work without fear, a community that had found its courage, and a warrior who had discovered a new way to serve. As the day shift began in earnest, the rhythms of hospital life continued their eternal cycle. Patients arrived seeking healing, staff worked their quiet miracles, and beneath it all ran the steady current of security that Nathan had built. The outlaws, who had meant to spread fear, had instead sparked a transformation, proving that sometimes the greatest victories come not from dramatic confrontations, but from the patient, dedicated work of protecting those who protect others. Through the hospital corridors, Nathan continued his rounds, his presence both reassuring and professional. He'd found his place in the civilian world, not by leaving his military experience behind, but by adapting it to serve a different kind of mission. In protecting St. Mary's, he protected not just his sister, but an entire community of healers and caregivers, allowing them to focus on their vital work without fear. The story of the Matthews siblings, the nurse and the Navy SEAL, had become part of hospital lore, but its true significance lay not in the dramatic confrontation that had started it all, but in the lasting changes that had followed. It was a reminder that courage takes many forms, that service continues long after uniforms are put aside, and that sometimes the greatest acts of protection are the quiet, consistent ones that transform fear into security, chaos into order, and strangers into community. The transformation of St. Mary's Hospital became a model for healthcare facilities across the region. What had started with one confrontation in a parking lot had evolved into a comprehensive approach to hospital security, blending military precision with healthcare compassion. Nathan's program had not only protected the hospital, but had created a blueprint for others to follow. 1 year after the incident, Sarah and Nathan stood in that same parking lot, now equipped with state-of-the-art security systems and staffed by well-trained officers. The morning sun cast familiar shadows, but everything else had changed. The hospital board had approved the regional training center, and Nathan was preparing to share his expertise with security teams from other facilities. "Remember when you first came back?" Sarah asked, sipping her morning coffee. "You were trying to figure out where you fit in civilian life. Now look at you, Director of Security Operations, running a training program, protecting not just one hospital, but helping secure dozens of them." Nathan nodded, his vigilant eyes still scanning the surroundings out of habit. "Sometimes you find your purpose in unexpected places," he replied. "The SEALs taught me to protect and serve. This is just a different kind of battlefield." The Blackhawks had become a cautionary tale in law enforcement circles. Their leadership was serving time, their intimidation tactics exposed and defeated, not just by force, but by a community's united stand against fear. Other outlaw groups had gotten the message. Hospitals were off limits, protected by people who knew how to guard what mattered. Sarah's new car still carried both the nurse's sticker and the SEAL trident, symbols of the different paths the Matthews siblings had chosen. But those paths had converged at St. Mary's, creating something stronger than either could have achieved alone. The hospital had become known not just for its medical care, but for its innovative approach to security. "You know what Mrs. Henderson said yesterday?" Sarah smiled, watching the morning shift arrive. "She said, we're not just treating patients anymore. We're showing other hospitals how to protect their healers. That's your legacy, Nathan." The security training center was set to open next month, housed in a renovated wing of St. Mary's. Nathan had designed the program himself, combining his military experience with practical healthcare security needs. It would train officers from hospitals across the country, spreading the lessons learned from one confrontation far beyond Pine Ridge. "It's not about being tough," Nathan often told his trainees. "It's about being prepared, being professional, and understanding that our job is to protect those who save lives." His quiet authority and practical experience had earned him respect throughout the healthcare security community. The morning sun climbed higher, another day beginning at St. Mary's. Emergency vehicles arrived with their urgent cases, families came to visit loved ones, and staff went about their vital work. But now they did so under the protection of a system designed by someone who understood both the warrior's duty and the healer's needs. "You know," Sarah said, preparing to start, "her shift. When you first stood up to those outlaws, everyone thought it was about proving how tough you were. But it wasn't, was it? It was about finding a new way to serve." Nathan watched as his security teams performed their morning rounds, their movements precise and professional. "Sometimes the best way to honor your training is to use it to protect others," he replied. "The SEALs taught me how to fight. St. Mary's taught me why to fight." As they parted ways, Sarah to her patients in the ER, Nathan to his security duties, the hospital hummed with the quiet efficiency of a place where people felt safe to do their vital work. The Matthews siblings had found their calling, protecting and healing in their own ways, their paths different, but their purpose the same. The story of the Navy SEAL who stood up to outlaws had become something more, a testament to how military service could find new expression in civilian life, how protection could take many forms, and how the bonds between siblings could strengthen. An entire community, St. Mary's Hospital, stood as proof that sometimes the greatest victories come not from dramatic confrontations, but from the patient, dedicated work of protecting those who protect others. And so, as another day began at St. Mary's, the legacy of that confrontation lived on, not in tales of violence, but in the quiet confidence of healthcare workers doing their jobs without fear, in the professional dedication of security teams trained to protect, and in the lasting transformation of a community that had learned to stand together against intimidation. If this story of bravery, family bonds, and standing up against intimidation resonated with you, we invite you to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring real-life stories. Each week, we bring you powerful narratives that showcase the extraordinary courage of ordinary people who make a difference in their communities. Like Nathan Matthews, who transformed his military experience into a force for positive change, we believe in the power of sharing stories that inspire action and hope. By subscribing, you'll join a community of viewers who appreciate tales of triumph, resilience, and the quiet heroes who walk among us. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell to ensure you never miss out on our weekly uploads of compelling true stories. From veterans finding new purpose to communities standing united against adversity, each video celebrates the human spirit's capacity for courage and transformation. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that. One person can make a difference. Leave a comment below about what this story meant to you, or share your own experience of standing up for what's right. Remember, sometimes the greatest acts of heroism aren't just in dramatic confrontations, but in the everyday dedication to protecting and serving others. Subscribe now to be part of this journey of discovery and inspiration. Together, we can celebrate and share these powerful stories of courage, redemption, and the strength that comes from standing up for what's right.